you're like us, you're probably tired of flipping through outdated and expensive regulation books and struggling to understand the rule or guidance you're after. eRigs is the first web and mobile app version of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, helping fleets of all types and sizes better access and understand their regulatory obligations. eRigs is always up to date and allows fleet safety professionals to not only read the rules, but also dig into FMCSA guidance and learn more about complex regulatory topics from industry experts. Highlight, bookmark, and take detailed notes right from the app and access them on any of your devices. And easily share a digital version of the regulations with your drivers so that they too can better understand the rules. eRigs was developed by safety professionals for safety professionals. Try it out for free at erigs.app. All right, hey everyone, welcome to episode 44, Trucksafe Live, show where we and our guests tackle hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon with Trucksafe, Childress Law, both of which are dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Got a full house today. Jared, Brian, Rob. Guys, what's going on?
What up, what up?
Good to see you.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
To you.
Early Christmas. Excited to be here today, so always looking forward to this particular show. This is our year-end review for 2024, looking back at some of the highlights from 2024 from a regulatory perspective, and then also looking ahead to what we might expect for 2025 in terms of rulemaking activity, enforcement, and all of that fun stuff. So looking forward to it. You guys ready to roll for Christmas? You got all your shopping done?
No, it's ready.
My wife got all the shopping done, so I'm good.
Classic. Rob, how about you?
Rob's excited.
All the shopping we're going to do is done.
Okay. Which is to say
You get
nothing?
nothing.
Or
No. I kind of got what I wanted all year long, and then so it was kind of like a mute point at the.
I don't care about you. I care about your kids, Rob.
Well, they get everything all year long too, so it's
Okay.
like Christmas every day.
You got room
Nice.
for one more?
I know. Right?
Jared's going to have to take up an offering for all his kids. Okay. Well, before we get started here, I want to say quick thanks to our sponsor, which is Taking the Higher Road, a Legacy Builders and Freightways production. Taking the Higher Road is a special podcast dedicated to addressing the trucking industry's greatest challenges, driver recruiting, retention, and compliance. Each week, host Jeremy Raymer, 20-year industry veteran and founder of Driver Reach and Legacy Builders, interviews industry experts and thought leaders who bring their insights to the driver life cycle. Be sure to check them out wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Taking the Higher Road. Appreciate it. A few things to mention for Trucksafe before we get into the topic. First up is our Trucksafe network. As always, if you're not a member of this, recommend you join it. Free to join over at trucksafenetwork.com, or if you scan that QR code on the screen there, you'll join our network. This is the space we've developed for safety professionals to gather together, learn from one another, ask questions, and also gain access to all of the content, the DOT-related content that we are constantly pushing out through Trucksafe. We've got an ongoing webinar series, in-depth webinar series that we have done on improving CSA scores. Still have one CSA basic left to go. I think hazmat we've kind of held off on doing, but we've got separate 1 hour webinars for all of the other 7 basics on our thoughts on how to improve those scores and some of the trends we're seeing. So that's just one example of some of the content that we offer to network members. So be sure to join that. Free to join, trucksafenetwork.com, or you can download the app in the App Store or the Google Play Store. The other thing I'll mention is our boot camps. Getting a lot of questions from folks wondering when we're going to hold our next fleet compliance boot camp. We held our last one in Indianapolis back in October, I think, of this year, 2024. We've been doing like one of these per year. So kind of in the early stages of planning our next one. It will probably be sometime late summer, early fall of 2025. Don't know where it's going to be. Don't know how much it's going to cost. Don't have a whole lot of details on that yet, but we all will be there again, and looking forward to having safety professionals come and join us. Probably expecting around 100 or so. This next one is kind of what we are anticipating. At least we'll have room for. So I think it'll be a great event. We'll always get a lot of good feedback on that. And so best way to keep up to date with that, if you want details on that, is by subscribing to our newsletter, trucksafe.com/subscribe. And then we will certainly send out information on that once we have nailed down the details. In the meantime, if you can't wait for that boot camp and you want one that's personalized to your own fleet or your own group of individuals who are working with these regulations, then get in touch with us. Ask us about our boot camp on the road. Brian and I have just spent the last 2 weeks out on the road. Where were we, Brian? Tampa and Detroit.
Tampa and Detroit.
Working with private groups on doing a customized boot camp for them at their locations for their folks, and it was a good time. A lot of great information, a lot of great back and forth with those folks. So if you're interested in something like that, give us a call, and happy to put something together for you.
Wasn't that largely focused on maintenance and actually doing in-person inspections on vehicles? It's kind of a different approach, very different than the boot camps we normally do.
Yeah, Brian, you want to give a summary, kind of what we did?
Sure. Yeah. So we did the normal fleet safety boot camps that we did, and then an additional thing that we did up in the Detroit one was adding on a piece for mechanics to understand the proper way to do an annual inspection, what to document it, how to document it, what's the difference between things that'll pass a roadside inspection without being out of service compared to things that are on the annual inspection list that need to be repaired right away. So yeah, we spent a whole day doing that. There was about half a day of classroom, and then the other half of the day was hands-on, and got to go down and get dirty and play with equipment for a while. So it was a good day.
Yeah. Then you got in my truck all covered in grease and stuff.
Did. Well, you know, price of doing business, I guess, or the cost of doing business.
I'm going to have to add that into the cost of those events. Repairs to my seats in my truck. Anyway, so if you're interested in anything like that, again, got great feedback from the fleets and the teams that we worked with on those. So would love to build something out like that for you if you're interested. So give us a call. Anyway, enough about us, I think. Let's get into today's topic. And if you're here with us, say hey in the comments. And as we go along, as always, if there's anything you want to talk about, or if you have any thoughts on these topics, throw it in the comments and we'll bring it up. But anyway, kind of how we've done this in the past and how I'm envisioning we do it today is that we first start off with some highlights from 2024. So what we saw from a rulemaking or an enforcement or even just big news in the trucking industry over the last year, and kind of how that impacted our clients and how it impacted the industry at large. And then we will look ahead to what we could expect possibly in 2025 from a rulemaking perspective or enforcement perspective or anything else. So that's kind of how we'll tackle it. Start first with looking back at 2024. First one I have on my list, guys, is Clearinghouse Phase 2. So this is probably actually the most recent one. It's actually probably ranks up there as one of the most significant ones from a fleet regulatory perspective. This took effect November 18th of this year, 2024, and we've got a lot of separate content on this. If you're interested in the nuts and bolts of it, you can go back and check that out. But Clearinghouse Phase 2, this closed a gap, pretty significant gap in the drug and alcohol clearinghouse that has been present since its implementation back in 2020, where drivers who are placed in prohibited status due to a drug or alcohol violation, even though they were prohibited from operating because of that violation, they ended up still having valid CDLs because the state driver's licensing agencies weren't necessarily checking the clearinghouse and weren't downgrading their CDLs because of that. So what changed November 18th was Clearinghouse Phase 2. FMCSA told the state driver's licensing agencies, as of this date, going forward, you have to now be using the clearinghouse and automatically downgrading the CDLs of any drivers who are in prohibited status due to a drug or alcohol clearinghouse violation. So big change. Thoughts on that?
Do we know if the state driver's licensing agencies have already initiated the mass downgrade, or is that still yet to happen? I thought it was a 60-day time period where they had to actually do the downgrading. I'm just not sure if that's already happened or if it's still going to happen.
I think it's still going. I think it's in progress. In fact, I saw an article come through, can't remember what publication, yesterday, I think, where the point of the article was to take issue with the sensationalization of this issue that some others have made of it, because it's easy to get in the mindset of, well, we've got 180,000 drivers in prohibited status in the clearinghouse, so all of a sudden 180,000 aren't going to have a CDL. Some have kind of pushed that, but it's really not to say that Clearinghouse Phase 2 is all of a sudden going to mean that 180,000 drivers now can't drive. It's not like, these drivers have been in prohibited status already. So anybody checking their clearinghouse status as they should have already weeded these drivers out of the industry anyway. It's just that now there's going to be an additional check on their on them, in that they're also going to lose their license, which they should have anyway. So all that's to say is a lot of these drivers had probably already exited the market. They're just not working in this industry anymore. But there are still certainly going to be a lot of drivers that are going to see their CDLs downgraded. And I think you're right, Jared. I think there was I think Clearinghouse Phase 2 had like a slow rollout to it. I can't remember what the time frame was, but I have already heard of some states starting to do that.
Well, we all know that there's a certain segment of the industry that they don't even know what the clearinghouse is. So, that also means that they're not running those reports. So now, at least when they run an MVR, they're going to find that the driver is downgraded, and they won't have to wait to find out roadside.
Yeah, and that gap was exploited by certain carriers. Not actually, well, they may have run the required query in the clearinghouse, but they may not have looked at it closely. We've come across carriers that kind of check the box in running the full query, and they just don't actually look at it and understand what it means. And so it's possible that carriers have hired some of these drivers that are then going to have their CDLs downgraded.
I never understood that because that's been a problem for years with the MVRs too, right? Carriers just pull those MVRs, just to check the box, stick them in the files, and without ever looking at them. The point of these things is for you to put eyes on them and see if there's anything that disqualifies these drivers from operating. So you can't just stuff it away without looking at it. You got to be looking at these things and taking action based on what you see in these documents.
Or they never look at them again. So it's like you run it the first time and that's it. And Clearinghouse is kind of funny because you do get the notification now, like, hey, there's new information that's been added to Rob Carpenter's Clearinghouse. And then no one ever does anything with it. Just like continuous MVR monitoring. It's like, hey, something's new in this guy's MVR and no one touches it. But like Brian said, I've been pretty surprised that I would say 1 out of 12 that I talk to and go to are not doing the original clearinghouse. And I mean, one of these people are like 100-year-old legacy company, and they They didn't know because
and it's been in effect for 5 years now.
Yeah.
So how you've gotten by 5 years without knowing is beyond
well,
me.
I think in some places it's because a lot of people have driving as a secondary role, whereas maybe they're service technicians driving a 33,000-pound fleet truck with a CDL. They just FMCSA isn't like there in front of them all the time, like an over-the-road fleet, for instance, where driving is your primary role. It's just maybe it's a gap from a knowledge standpoint. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's probably I think that's consistent with what I've seen. It's mainly the the private fleets, the ones that aren't traditional trucking companies that seem to be missing it because they're just not tuned in as closely to these rules as a for hire trucking company. So that's probably
Well, we still see mistakes on drivers that are supposed to take their licenses to the DMV after they or take their physicals to the DMV after they have one. And we see mistakes there, and drivers have been, cited and written violations for having their license downgraded because they didn't put their medical on file.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's just, if you're in this industry, whether you're a carrier or a driver, you got to stay tuned in to at least some source of information on keeping up to date with these rules because, even though they don't change all that frequently or all that dramatically, they do change occasionally. So if you're not keeping up with them, you're putting yourself at risk pretty significantly. I mean, if you, like you said, Brian, if you don't give them your med card, then they're going to downgrade your CDL. Then you're going to be out there operating without a CDL. Next thing you know, you're getting out of service violations, and God forbid you end up in litigation. That's just not going to look good. So,
well, and if you don't follow publications and don't follow like what we do, and maybe your insurance carriers and give you information and stuff like that, it like Rob said, those 100-year-old legacy companies where it's just business as usual every day, and they're out of that loop of getting that type of information, then it's super easy to watch this stuff walk right by you.
Yeah.
Hopefully, go ahead, Rob.
I've been at 3 in the past 2 weeks, and all 3 of them had that same med cert self-certification process issue for CDLs. It's like, hey, we've got a vendor in place that tracks this stuff, and they track the expiration, and then we get the new med card, but then the rest of that process where it's verifying the national registry or, hey, did you self-certify and take your med card at the DMV? It's like that whole second part of it is there's an ignorance factor to it, I think, in a lot of cases, especially the same in secondary fleets. But it's more bleeding. It's more involved on the primary side too, not just the secondary fleet.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm hoping that this phase 2 that kicks in hopefully starts a wave of drivers exiting prohibited status and actually starting that return to duty process. Because once the CDLs are downgraded, they're going to have no choice but to do that. So hopefully we see thousands of drivers start that return to duty process and actually get back on the road.
We'll see. I don't have much hope, unfortunately. But
yeah, and then that opens a whole nother Pandora's box. Then who are they driving for?
Right.
Who were they driving for?
Yeah.
Is that the question you're asking?
No, who they're going to drive for now.
Well, there's carriers that will take on a driver that's completed return to duty testing and they're not in prohibited status anymore. But again, you're taking on that testing plan in the future, and it's up to you as the motor carrier to make sure that it's carried out. And that in and of itself creates some risk.
Yeah, and they're few and far between, those carriers. Certainly the bigger carriers. Bigger the carrier, probably less risk adverse or more risk adverse, and so less likely to bring on those types of drivers. But yeah, big concern. All right, so that's Clearinghouse Phase 2. That was, like I said, most recent change we saw from FMCSA this past year. I don't have the clearinghouse data in front of me. That was the next thing on my list, but I think the number that we're always just baffled by are the nearly 180,000 drivers that are in prohibited status currently. And that number just keeps ticking up month after month after month, and it's just a ridiculous number at this point. 180,000 CDL drivers not able to operate because of a drug or alcohol testing violation in their past, and only a small, actually those are the ones that are in prohibited status having not even started the return to duty process, and then there's a small fraction of that number that have started that return to duty process to get back in the trunk, but very, very, very small, relatively speaking.
This will go a little off topic, but for as many that are in the clearinghouse now in a prohibited status for urine only testing or for alcohol testing, it's like when you start getting into these other testing methods that are approved, like hair follicle or oral fluid, and then how many more are going to be in there? How much is that going to increase? Because, I was talking to a carrier last week, which is a large carrier. I mean, 2,000 trucks and big fuel hauler. They're doing in-house policy-driven oral fluid testing. And they did a sample of their drivers, and out of 17 positives on hair follicle testing, only one of those positives on hair follicle were positive for urine.
Wow.
So I thought that was pretty interesting. So I think if that ever kicks off, I think that 180,000 number is going to go way up.
Yeah, if we end up with a more sensitive, allowable DOT test type, we will probably, it just makes sense. We would see those numbers rise even more dramatically and even more quickly than we have with the urinalysis. And, that's probably a good point to talk about oral fluid testing, because that's also on the list. This is something that has been in the works for a long time at this point. So I think FMCSA pushed forward with the final rule back in 2023, so last year, that paves the way for fleets to start using oral fluid testing in addition to or in lieu of urinalysis for DOT mandated drug test. The thing we've been waiting on, though, that has rendered this useless at this point, is that there are no laboratories set up or approved yet that can process those test results from oral fluid testing. So even though the framework, the regulatory framework, is in place for oral fluid testing, unless and until we get those labs, at least 2 labs certified, fleets aren't authorized to use it yet. And also, we're still waiting on them to approve the testing device for those types of tests. And so we've been in limbo now for almost a year, if not over a year, waiting for that. And so it's kind of a look back at this year, but also a look forward to next year, hoping, but we've been saying this for months at this point, but hopefully by next year, we will have those labs in place, and fleets will start being able to take advantage of those types of tests. Any thoughts on oral fluid testing as compared to urinalysis, guys?
I mean, I definitely like it when it comes to, no more shy bladder issues for a safety manager to deal with. There's no more, having to have same sex there for observed tests, because they're all observed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
you're just spitting in a tube, essentially.
Yeah, that's the apparatus that I've seen, where it you spit into the top and it goes down and it splits off into two. Yeah, it splits off into two, and then there's a way that they take that apart and seal it and all that. But it does take all the issues with hair testing away too. Because there's a segment of society that they can't cut they can't take the hair. So there's really no issues as far as anything that we've seen that I can see with the other types of testing.
Yeah, if you look in that final rule, if anybody's interested, if you look in that FMCSA's final rule that paved the way for oral fluid testing, they've got some interesting data in there about, comparing the testing window or detection windows for oral fluid testing versus urinalysis. From what I recall, I mean, I'm no scientist, but from what I recall, they were pretty comparable to one another. But yeah, I think the big deal with it is they are easier to administer, and there is less of a chance of, some kind of funny business with drivers trying to cheat the system with urinalysis, where since they're not observed, substituting urine with some kind of prosthetic or fake urine or whatever they do, which has become a big problem with urinalysis. So the idea, I think, is oral fluid testing. They're all observed, so less of a chance for that type of thing. So I think it'll be a good option for fleets. I get the sense that maybe they may be a little bit more expensive, if I remember correctly, than urinalysis, but not prohibitively expensive from what I recall.
Well, and I've done it, with non-DOT fleets, when you're doing like a policy-driven test, we've used it in the past, that and ECUP, and both of them are a whole lot faster and a whole lot cheaper. I don't know if that'll still be the case when it's a federal test, because then you're obviously going to have 2 specimens instead of 1, and other things that are going to happen. But another thing with this is it'll kill the negative dilute piece. You're not going to have to think about that part. So if that's a policy thing for you. But anyway, that's my take historically.
Yeah. I think I did see in the final rule, you mentioned shy bladder, Brian, and this doing away with it. I think there is something about like dry mouth issues or something like that. I can't remember what it said, but that would be the analog. Yeah. Okay. So that's oral fluid testing. The other big thing we saw this past year, and this is even more recent than the Clearinghouse Phase 2, was the expansion of the crash preventability determination program. Brian, you want to give a summary of kind of what we saw there?
Sure. Yeah, they added 4 new crash types. They had some special wording in those crash types, so you're still going to have to be careful with how you submit these and make sure the information that you put with them is accurate. Like the being hit in the side, going the same direction, that is an accepted one now. The loss of control and being struck by another vehicle, but it has to say in the police report or the crash report that the other vehicle lost control. That's imperative to that one. The third one was vehicles coming out from a driveway or a parking lot or something like that and striking. This was a conversation, Brandon, you and I had last week, striking the CMV. So not the CMV striking the car. So if they come out and they hit the side of the truck, then that counts. However, the fourth one kind of would take care of the third one, because the fourth one is anything video-wise that shows the sequence of events that shows that the driver could not have prevented the crash. So, if someone pulls out in front of the truck in a side, on a side street or a parking lot or something like that, if video shows that there was absolutely no time to react, that's where that one would fall. So, you want to make sure that you file it under the correct crash type and understand the nuances to each one. But, that one with video is absolutely huge.
That's a big deal.
And then it went into effect December 1st, although we are still waiting. As far as I know, we're still waiting on the FMCSA to say, okay, we've updated our site. You can go ahead and submit those crash types now.
Yeah, it'll be retroactive to December 1st. Once they get the website ready to accept those new crash types.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know if I was breaking up or something during then. Felt like I was freezing up. Okay.
But yeah, that video one is a big deal. It's a big win for fleets that have forward facing cameras or any kind of cameras on the trucks that could show the sequence of events. It's kind of a catch-all. If you get the video and it shows that your driver wasn't at fault or couldn't have prevented the accident, then I think you submit that challenge with the video evidence and see how it goes. So.
Well, I think one of the things with that, though, is like how subjective will this get with the reviewers? Because, there's a lot of videos that I post online where it looks, from just an everyday person perspective, it's like, well, there's no way the truck could have avoided that or prevented that. But then when you actually take into other considerations that they may not have thought of, like, hey, looking far enough ahead to say, hey, there's people merging into traffic, I should slow down or I should merge left. It's like, hey, how much subjectivity is the reviewer going to put into it to say, I don't agree that this wasn't preventable? So, there's that piece of it.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rob, and that highlights one of the big reasons why you should absolutely submit a letter in addition to this video documentation. Obviously, the police report that's required, but submitting a narrative on what happened and your point of view and why it shouldn't count against the carrier. I mean, you need to do that on every single crash. If you're going to submit it, just submit the police report and the video and then the short little paragraph in the box when you're submitting the RDR. I mean, that may not be far enough for you. So it's really important to submit a really detailed letter.
Yeah. But it's a good caution from Rob that, whenever it comes to the data queue system, which is where you file these preventability challenges, it is not going to be your savior. Do not look to that as something that's going to save your scores or anything like that. There's a lot of subjectivity built into it. But nevertheless, these changes are welcomed changes. Continuing to expand this program so that fleets aren't and drivers aren't negatively impacted by accidents that they couldn't have prevented anyway. It just makes sense that we have something like that. Problem is that subjectivity creeps into it, and so you end up, having to eat the bullet on some of those. But it is what it is. So anyway, that was crash.
One other thing that they did was they revised some of the existing crash types. Yeah. One of the things that happens frequently that I've seen with carriers and helped them with these filings is when you have someone that hits your truck under the influence and it may not qualify for one of the other existing crash types, they actually relaxed that standard of that crash type to where you no longer have to have proof of an arrest and documentation in that regard. You can have police reported indications of intoxication to qualify for this crash type in the future.
Yeah, that's a good change. Yeah, hopefully that will kind of expand it more for fleets that need to take advantage of that. Okay, those were changes to the crash preventability determination program. The other thing I wanted to mention from this past year, we saw the FMCSA ramp up its oversight of ELD manufacturers. So we saw several ELD devices revoked from the self-certified list of devices over this past year. Probably, I mean, not a ton, but probably a dozen or two over this past year, which is a dozen or two more than it had done historically. And so, I think that's important as the list of ELD devices continues to grow. The issue we have with our ELD system here in the States is that there's no third party that has to, and certainly not the FMCSA, that has to sign off on these devices to ensure that they meet the technical specifications for those devices. It's the manufacturers themselves that self-certify that, hey, yeah, we are certifying our devices meet these requirements. Well, turns out that some of the devices don't meet those standards, even though they have been certified by the manufacturers. And so we are starting to see FMCSA crack down on that a little bit. And I think, Jared, in our experience, what we're seeing is usually FMCSA will only initiate an investigation after they get some repeated complaints about a system, or more likely they're seeing lots of problems roadside with a particular device. They will go in and ask that manufacturer for documentation, and if they decide that it doesn't meet the technical specs, then they will revoke it. So that we've seen that quite a few times.
Yeah, we see issues with missing required data points in the logs when they're transferred through eRods. The FMCSA kind of maintains an exception report list, a naughty list, if you will, and they'll generate investigations based on repeated, failures to transfer through eRods with the required data points. Industry complaints can also generate investigations. I've definitely observed the FMCSA being more aggressive with investigating ELD vendors, certainly in the last 12, 18 months. They've gotten a little more aggressive. As it stands right now, we have approximately 250 revoked ELDs. So if you go to the list of self-certified ELD vendors, there's a tab at the top that says self-certified, and then there's also a tab at the top that says revoked devices. You can click on revoked devices and search that whole list and find which devices have been revoked. And again, it's not indicative of all of those have been investigated and revoked by the FMCSA. There's a lot of reasons why a device can be revoked voluntarily, sales of the business or failed business, whatever the case may be. So not necessarily all investigations there, but it's really important as a carrier that you're signed up to get notifications from FMCSA, because that's where you're going to get that email that says, here's the list of revocations for ELD. The last one that they sent on December 11th revoked 4 devices, and they instructed the motor carriers that are using those devices to switch to paper logs, and said that they had until February 9th to replace the ELD with an approved ELD. And so if you get that notice, a lot of times the vendor will reach out to FMCSA immediately and start trying to work with them on getting reinstated. Doesn't always work. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If it happens pretty quick usually. But I think communicating with the vendor at that point, if there's hope that reinstatement is going to occur, set yourself like a 2-week deadline or something like that, where you're going to say, okay, we're going to use paper for 2 weeks, and then we're signing a contract with another vendor, because we can't be, twisting in the wind with this revoked ELD on our trucks, or running paper beyond February 9th. So being proactive, absolutely critical there.
Now, to be clear, the devices revoked involuntarily so far have, at least from my perspective, been like pretty minor players in that industry. It's not like they're out there revoking the big boys that the major fleets have installed on their trucks. It's lesser known ELD devices that have been revoked. So maybe some of you can take some comfort from that fact. But
some of that goes back to what Jared said about being proactive. It's not just proactive in like monitoring. Is your vendor on the list? It's vendor selection is big too. So, if you're going into this and you're looking for like the $4 Bob's ELD service, obviously there could be issues long term. So, especially if you have a huge fleet, the amount of work that has to go into removing that, teaching people how to use a new system, reinstalls, it's like just pay $5 more a month and you'll have some reputable carrier that's going to be in business for, hopefully long term. But vendor selection's big in it too. I just never understood this whole thing.
You're right, Rob. It's absolutely huge. An easy sanity check that you can do, if you're looking at a device, see if they're certified in Canada, because they have to be certified by a third party there. That's not the ultimate test, but I'm saying that certainly represents a vendor that has their stuff together if they've gone through Canadian testing. Now, there's plenty of vendors that have chosen not to be in the Canadian market, or they've selected a white label to use in Canada. Certainly not saying that if a vendor is not Canadian approved that they're not a good vendor, but that's a sanity check that you can use.
Yeah.
All right, a couple other things here, and then we'll move on to kind of an outlook for 2025. Worth briefly mentioning some of the major lawsuits that we saw over the past year. Not all of these have started in the last year, but have kind of picked up steam over the last year. The Werner case, we're constantly referring to that Werner case, the Texas case where Werner got hit with a hundreds of millions of dollar jury verdict in Texas. This is still under appeal. It's been going on for years. I think it's at the Texas Supreme Court right now. But Werner's driver, basic facts of the case, Werner had it was like a trainee driver, right? Like a fairly new driver driving in bad weather, but was driving under the speed limit. And was driving in his lane, and then a passenger car from the opposite lane spun out of control and entered into the Werner's lane and impacted Werner, and ended up killing a couple of folks in that accident, I think, from the passenger car. Was that also the passengers weren't wearing seatbelts, right? In the passenger car. I get some of these accidents mixed up. Was that the Wabash one?
Wabash.
Yeah, that's the Wabash one.
Yeah.
Was there alcohol involved in the Werner case? Okay.
Wabash.
All right. No, that was Wabash too. Okay, so Werner, the other car just spun out because of the bad weather and entered the Werner truck driver's lane and resulted in fatalities. Long story short, really, in terms of what the Werner driver was doing, from all accounts, he couldn't have really been doing anything more to have prevented that accident. In other words, nothing he could have done to have prevented the accident in the situation as it was. Yet Werner ends up with a hundreds of $1 million verdict awarded against it. The rationale being, from what I understand, the arguments were that Werner may have violated some of its own internal policies about having trainee drivers operating out in bad weather. And so the plaintiff's attorney's argument was, well, if you had followed your own rules, you wouldn't have had this driver out there operating anyway and could have avoided this accident. So point is, pretty crazy facts, and just highlights how some of these nuclear verdict type cases play out, and really makes it a tough environment for fleets to know what exactly is expected of them and what they can do to minimize their exposure when you're dealing with cases like that. And also the Wabash case. So the Wabash case was a more recent one. Involved Wabash trailers, and it was, from what I understand, again, basic facts, a pretty old trailer. I can't remember the date it was manufactured, but manufactured many years ago, manufactured to standards that were in place at the time the trailer was manufactured. So it, in particular, the rear impact guards for those trailers, the guards that hang down below the trailer to prevent cars from underwriting from the back. And so the trailer, as I understand it, had been manufactured according to the standards in place at the time of the manufacture. But a trailer was used and then involved in an accident where a passenger car, underrode that trailer and killed some people. And the argument of the plaintiff's attorney was that, hey, even though it met the regulatory standards in place at the time of the accident, Wabash could have done more. It could have implemented even stronger controls for it, or more robust underride guards. And Wabash ended up with hundreds of millions of dollar jury verdict awarded against it. And in that case, I think that was the one that the evidence was that the driver of the passenger vehicle in that case had alcohol in his system and was not wearing a seatbelt. So aggravating circumstances on his part. So again, just another...
But the jury was not allowed to hear that information.
Right.
Yeah, that was all withheld.
So it's just these types of cases that make you scratch your head. If you're a fleet, what could we have done to have avoided these things? And there's not a whole lot that you can do to avoid these things. I mean, certainly what you can do is make sure you're following all applicable laws, because if you're not following the laws, then you're really opening yourself up in those cases. But even in these cases just highlight that even if you're doing what the law requires of you, oftentimes that's not enough. The plaintiff's bar is going to be casting you as a bad actor one way or the other. And the ways that they do that are, your historic safety data. What do your CSA scores look like? Are you doing other things that have become industry standard? And if not, maybe that's evidence of your negligence. So, just watch out for these things. Keep abreast of these types of cases. Take whatever lessons you can take from them. And, yeah, that's about all I have to say about this.
I've heard the phrase multiple times in the Werner case there at the Supreme Court, do care.
Mm-hmm.
And even to the point where they were arguing whether or not that truck should have had a CB in it, was the company taking due care. And
yeah.
So, I mean, they're getting down, because he should have been able to get on the CB and say, or, find out what the conditions were and stuff like that. Well, he had been in those conditions for a serious length of time. He knew what they were, and that's why he was driving like he was driving. So in my eyes, he was taking due care, but that is a phrase that I think is going to be more prevalent going forward.
Yeah. And, the other point is these cases are pushing along what's called tort reform in several states. Texas is an example. Florida is another recent example of states that have recently enacted some level of tort reform aimed at kind of curbing lawsuit abuse. Not to, I'm not weighing in on these particular cases and whether there's any kind of formal lawsuit abuse. There may be, there may not be, but the point of that type of legislation is to put an end to some of the tactics, the unfair tactics that the plaintiff's bar has employed to end up with these multi-million-dollar verdicts against trucking companies specifically. Sometimes this type of legislation is specific to trucking, other times it's broader, but the point is to cut out some of that type of stuff so that we get verdicts that are more fair, looking at it objectively. So.
Yeah, and another thing, these cases are really good examples of the tactic plaintiffs bar oftentimes will use where, particularly in the Werner case, not focusing on the facts of the crash at all. Make it about everything but the facts of the crash. Because if you just look at the facts of the crash, it looks like the Werner driver couldn't have done anything different. But they make it about the policies, how they're administered, the safety culture of the company, and you should assume that's how the cases are going to go if you ever get involved in one. So it's a good reason to do a sanity check on your policies and all of those things, because they could turn out to be one of the things that the case turns on.
I mean, both of these to me ran like counter to common sense and like just personal responsibility, especially the Wabash one. It was like, if you're drunk and you don't have a seatbelt on, there's an inherent level of responsibility that you should have accepted. Obviously, you're dead, but your family at that point. And but going to what you're talking about, Jared, it's like the emotional extortion of juries, where it's like, hey, don't pay attention to what's really important. It's like, look over here at this, and it just it gets people emotionally charged, and then they make a decision to hold somebody responsible for someone else's personal decision.
Yeah. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, and it's the undercurrent too, that it's the big bad trucking company, and they've got insurance, they've got all the money in the world. Let's get a big verdict here, jury. And you're right, it's kind of an extortion of the jury.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on then. That's kind of a look back at some of the major headlines from 2024. Let's look ahead to 2025 with what time we've got left. I see somebody on LinkedIn is asking a question which I think goes to this. They're asking, what do you think about the emergence of autonomous driving and the impact on jobs and that type of stuff? And I think that's probably a good place to start with autonomous trucking and what we might expect for 2025. Frankly, I'm not holding my breath that we're going to see anything on autonomous trucking in 2025. The last we saw from a regulatory perspective, I should say, certainly the autonomous trucking is taking off in terms of the technology and the fleets that are adopting it and the amount of operations that are taking root in different parts of the country, namely Texas. But in terms of rulemaking, probably I don't anticipate seeing much on that in 2025, if anything. I just think FMCSA is so behind on other stuff that they got going on, and NHTSA, that I don't know. I just don't. I'm not going to hold my breath. We have seen FMCSA and NHTSA issue a joint advanced notice of proposed rulemaking probably 2 years ago on this topic, where they were starting to get the ball rolling on it and asking the public what issues they should think about for autonomous trucking in terms of developing a regulatory framework for that. But we haven't heard anything on it since that time. And so, at some point we're going to have to get a regulatory framework for that, because right now we have no regulations governing it. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of my outlook for it. I don't see it coming to fruition in 2025 in any significant form. You guys have other thoughts?
I think in some cases, like you have autonomous vehicles running in like Texas, where there's nothing but flat land, and the environment is fit for it. And I think, like Elon Musk said, 50 years you're going to have autonomous vehicles run the road with no drivers. Yes, I believe that. But I think right now and in the near future, you're talking like specific use cases that will work, but not widespread.
Hub to hub makes sense. Long haul, hub to hub.
Yeah, turnpike operations, stuff like that. They'd shoot, they're pulling twin 53s up there. Just about anything goes. So, yeah, those types of operations I could see them being used for.
Yeah, in the absence of some large scale regulatory activity, I mean, the commercialization of AVs to where these companies can actually start making money, which is kind of the big deal. It's just not going to happen at this point. I mean, there has to be some regulation, and at some point, these companies have been taking in investor money, doing all the research and the building and the testing, and they're not making money. How long can that last?
I think a lot of the manufacturers welcome regulation because the last thing they want to do is invest all this money in technology that then gets rendered obsolete by regulations that prohibit it being used in that particular way. So they want a framework in place so that they know what rules they're playing by. Just
exactly. And my point being, I think it would be an absolute shame if all this technological advancement died on the vine because the federal government couldn't get it together enough to issue regulations. And we can't talk about 2025 without talking about the Trump administration and how, I mean, it's almost undoubted there's going to be less regulation under that administration. So it makes it even less likely at that point.
Yeah. And yeah, let's just move to that. Obviously, that's going to be the significant change coming up in 2025. New administration means big changes for federal agencies, of which FMCSA and USDOT are part of that. And so we know that there are going to be changes. We're going to have a new Secretary of Transportation. Pete Buttigieg is going to be out of that job. Trump has already nominated somebody else, I think a former congressman from Wisconsin. And so that will have to get pushed through the Senate. We will probably then see a new FMCSA administrator get appointed, and that would have to be Senate confirmed. And that's just, as we know, that's a revolving door there at the FMCSA administrator position. I think we've had probably 8 or 9 administrators over the last 5 or 6 years. It's just been a crazy number. And we will likely see another new one. And then the other thing that I think we should expect once Trump takes office, we saw this when he took office in 2016. He implemented back then what I think they called his 2-for-1 rule, which was that for every new regulation that a federal agency wanted to push forward, they had to target 2 existing regulations to get rid of. And so if they want to move forward with a new rule, then they have to get rid of 2 existing rules. I haven't heard on anything on this recently, but I think on the campaign trail, Trump had mentioned that he was going to do something similar, but maybe like a 10-for-1 rule, where if you wanted to push forward one new regulation, you had to target 10 existing regulations to get rid of. Obviously, the point of that is to dissuade extensive rulemaking activity by federal agencies, which is part and parcel with a Republican administration. The whole idea being smaller federal government, larger state activity. So I think we should expect something like that.
Part of that is, I think, going to be made better by, depends on how you look at it, but for me, it would be better. But the slower rulemaking process because of Chevron and how that whole thing is going to kind of, I think, maybe blend together with it to kind of slow things down a little bit. I think some regulations, like I think speed limiter, someone posted yesterday, speed limiter was going to happen in 2025. And I'm like, not in your life. There's a different emitting coming in, and that's going to kill that, I think. But
yeah, I mean, that's a good point. We didn't talk about Chevron, but that was another huge development in 2024, not just for trucking, but certainly significantly impacts trucking. We don't have time to get into it, but is a major Supreme Court decision that significantly it redistributes the balance of power between the branches of government. They had been largely federal agencies have been given a lot of deference in terms of them interpreting their own rules because of a case from the 80s called Chevron. A lot of federal courts defer to agencies when it comes to their own rulemaking activity. Well, now the case that came out this year, I can't remember, Loberbright, I think was the name of it, Supreme Court case, essentially got rid of the Chevron deference. And so now federal agencies or federal courts are not beholden to agency interpretations of those agencies' own enabling statutes. So giving a lot less deference to federal agencies going forward. And this could very well impact trucking. We've seen federal courts defer to FMCSA specifically in past rulemaking activities that get challenged in court. The one that comes to mind is the ELD rulemaking that got tied up in federal court for many years. And ultimately the federal courts deferred to the FMCSA and said, hey, you guys are the experts on this. We're going to let you move forward with it. Going forward now with Chevron not being a thing, maybe we don't see that type of deference. So it should be interesting. A couple other things to look forward to in 2025 if you're a fleet. Upcoming changes to the safety measurement system, CSA scores. This will be a big one. FMCSA first proposed these back in 2023 and has been working on them over the last year. We recently, within the last month or so, they came out with a new notice that said they're still pushing forward with these. They've made some tweaks to it, but fairly significant changes to the way that they calculate CSA scores. We've got like a 2-hour podcast where we went through all of those changes if you're interested in it. But yeah, be on the lookout for that. They haven't given us a deadline of when those are going to take effect, but it's probably going to drop in 2025. So
yeah, it'll be like the crash stuff. All of a sudden, hey, Friday, these are going live. Okay,
yeah.
Thanks. I think that's about as much notice as we're going to get.
Yeah, because it's not a rulemaking, so it doesn't
Right.
require a final rule and a comment period or anything like that. So that will take effect. Again, if you're interested in what those changes are, go back and check out our content on it. Speed limiters, Rob mentioned it. You know, it's on the DOT's agenda as it has been for the last, 10 years. Probably. It's a joint rulemaking between FMCSA and NHTSA that would, if it ever moves forward, would mandate speed limiters on newly manufactured vehicles after a certain date. What the speed would be set to, we've only heard, guesses. I think 68 is what most people are thinking is where it would land. But the big wild card is that ever going to get pushed forward? I think it's on the agenda for May of 2025 of when the FMCSA and NHTSA are going to revisit it, but that keeps getting pushed back. And it's probably going to get kicked down the line even further now with the change of administration. So I'm with Rob. I don't see that happening in 2025. Any other thoughts on that, guys?
Nope, I'm with you. I don't think it's going to get pushed through now or then or even again over then. So
Yeah.
It's going to be a while.
Yeah. We already mentioned oral fluid testing. So then the last one that I would mention are potential changes to safety fitness determinations, safety ratings. The 3-tier system that we currently have, satisfactory, conditional, or unsat. These are ratings that the FMCSA issues to motor carriers that have gone through a DOT audit. And, they've been toying around with changing up the way that they assign those ratings for many years. But it has remained consistently the same. They haven't made those changes. They came out with an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on this in 2024 saying, hey, we're thinking about potentially changing the way we assign ratings, including potentially tying them to a carrier's CSA scores. But it's very early on in the rulemaking, and so they would ultimately have to put together a notice of proposed rulemaking, open that up for comments, and give us some more details on it. Crystal ball again. I don't think we're going to see a proposed rule on it. We may see a proposed rule on it. We're definitely not going to see it take effect in 2025, if I had to guess. But we could see some movement on it in 2025, if I had to guess. What I'm suspecting that they will do is they will drop these safety measurement system changes on us here shortly. And then they will, after they do that, then they will start to think about whether they should tie a carrier safety rating to those CSA scores. So that would be a significant shift from the way that we currently do things. We would end up with potentially a lot more carriers having a safety rating than the 5% or so that currently have safety ratings.
Which could be worse for some people.
Could end up with a lot more carriers getting shut down because of it. So, All right. I know some of us have to go at 3:00, so we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We could have spent probably another 3 hours talking about that type of stuff, but we just don't have the time. Again, best way to keep in touch with us and what we've got going on is subscribing to our newsletter, so we hope you do that. Check out our online courses. We got a lot of courses on DOT compliance issues for fleet safety professionals. You can check those out and everything else we got going on at trucksafe.com. Anyway, appreciate you spending time with us. Looking forward to doing these in the new year. Thanks, guys, for joining me. We will see everybody next time. Later.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.